Welcome to this fifth in the series of devotionals in the Psalms that particularly show their liturgical use in the temple worship of Israel, and particularly in that time after the faithful remnant has returned to Jerusalem after the exile. Psalm 74, a maskil of Asaph, another maskil. Most likely a maskil means it's for our instruction, a psalm for gaining wisdom. As it's read or sung, we are to meditate upon it, and as we do, our understanding grows. We become instructed and wise. And as we enter into this psalm, we realise that it is set in those painful years after Israel's exile in Babylon. A remnant has returned to Jerusalem, rebuilt her walls, rebuilt the temple, but things are not the same. God's blessing seems far from his people. In hard times, Asaph, one of the temple musicians, raises this song of lament. O God, why have you rejected us forever? Why does your anger smoulder against the sheep of your pasture? Remember the nation you purchased long ago, the people of your inheritance, whom you redeemed, Mount Zion, where you dwelt. Turn your steps toward these everlasting ruins, all this destruction the enemy has brought on the sanctuary. Your foes roared in the place where you met with us. They set up their standards as signs. They behaved like men wielding axes to cut through a thicket of trees. They smashed all the carved panelling with their axes and hatchets. They burned your sanctuary to the ground. They defiled the dwelling place of your name. They said in their hearts, we will crush them completely. They burned every place where God was worshipped in the land. So this is a lament, and it looks back at the exile as Babylonian troops stormed into Jerusalem, bringing destruction and death with them. The temple was ransacked and desecrated. It was burned to the ground in an attempt to stop the worship of God. Whichever priests were not killed were transported back to Babylon, along with all of Israel's brightest and best. One of the characteristics of lament, a song of lament or a psalm of lament, is the revisiting and reliving of the tragedy. Grief is a journey to be followed through to its end. And then we cycle back around and we do it all again. Not forever, mind you, but grieving is work to be done. Resolution and healing comes in God's time, but in the meantime we rehearse our grief as a way of processing our loss. We remember the good times. We work through the hard times. And that's what's going on in this psalm. Asaph leads the worshipper in working through the exile and its fallout. Even though returned to Jerusalem and to the temple worship, the good times have not come back. There is still an overwhelming sense of abandonment. Verse 9 continues the lament in the present. We are given no signs from God. No prophets are left, and none of us knows how long this will be. How long will the enemy mock you, God? Will the foe revile your name forever? Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Take it from the folds of your garment and destroy them. Notice here how the lament it's now moving on to imprecation. God, come on, overthrow the evildoers. Why delay? But as with all prayers of imprecation, justice and vengeance belongs to God alone. He decides if and when he will act against the evildoers. And so in the waiting, this psalm turns our attention to God's faithfulness. And such, the tone lifts, the key does change. And looking back, we see that God has never let his people down. They are never finally abandoned. Verse 12. but God is my King from long ago. He brings salvation on the earth. It was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert. It was you who opened up springs and streams. You dried up the ever-flowing rivers. The day is yours, and yours also the night. You established the sun and the moon. It was you who set all the boundaries of the earth. You made both summer and winter. Taking a step back to deliberately remember and recall the faithfulness of God actually anchors us in times of despair. Facing the tragic effects of the exile, the emptiness of knowing that things are not the same as before, and the sadness of small returns or unreached ambitions, hopes that seem forlorn, with the psalmist we can face these hard times only in the greater context of God's faithfulness. Until the day of Christ's return, God is not done yet. His great purposes are not complete, and we won't necessarily know what good is to come. And so, assured of God's sovereign care, Psalm 74 returns to pleading for God to act. Once again, God, He is the one to judge. He is the one whose honour is at stake. And it seems that this is the instruction that the psalm brings into our difficult experiences. The wisdom we are to meditate upon through this psalm is that God is the one whose reputation is actually on the line. His name is what ultimately matters, not so much ours. And so verse 18, remember how the enemy has mocked you, Lord, how foolish people have reviled your name. Do not hand over the life of your dove to wild beasts. Do not forget the lives of your afflicted people forever. Have regard for your covenant, because haunts of violence fill the dark places of the land. Do not let the oppressed retreat in disgrace. May the poor and needy praise your name. Rise up, O God, and defend your cause. Remember how fools mock you all day long. Do not ignore the clamour of your adversaries, the uproar of your enemies, which rises continually. Psalm 74 lifts our eyes up from our circumstances and our concern for our reputation, whether good or bad, honourable or humble. And our eyes are lifted up to see that it is God's name, His reputation, and it's His honour that ultimately matters. The mocking of enemies is not our problem, but it's His problem. The accusations of slanderers might hurt us, they might wound our pride, but ultimately it is God's reputation that is on the line. We yearn that He will show Himself holy, faithful and true. And He will do that according to His purpose and timing. If we're feeling forlorn, abandoned and desperate, this waiting for God can be hard. What do we do with these times? Well, we work through this psalm and others like it that remind us of God's goodness and His faithfulness in the past. One of the reasons we read all the way through the long history of the Old Testament is that it retells the story of God. He's the Creator. He's the Sustainer. He's the one who made the promises. His purpose will prevail through all the ups and the downs, despite and through His people. This patient waiting marked the centuries between the books of Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, and Matthew, the first book of the New Testament in our Bibles. Waiting, trusting, rehearsing the stories, this was the pattern of faithful people leading up to the arrival of Jesus Christ. And as we await His return, This can be our pattern too.